Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Katie Propp, the Conservation Education Director at Penguins International, and I am so excited to welcome Dr. Katta Ludynia, the recipient of our 2023 Scientist Spotlight. So Dr. Katta Ludynia is the marine biologist and penguin scientist currently serving as SANCCOB's research manager. For those of you that are unfamiliar, SANCCOB is the Southern African Foundation for the Conservation of Coastal Birds. And Dr. Ludynia is actively involved in projects related to fishing and population dynamics. She provides strategic leadership to SANCCOB as a thought leader in seabird conservation and has been instrumental in expanding partnerships with relevant South African and international academic institutions. Dr. Kata, congratulations, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
We're really excited to have you with us, and we were hoping that you could share with our audience today a little bit about your penguin research.
Yeah, so it's actually quite diverse and it's evolving all the time. I guess as kind of new questions come up, new problems come up. So I've actually started my research mostly looking at foraging ecology. So where do birds or where do penguins and other seabirds actually go to find their fish? What are some of the problems? What do they eat? All these things. That then has evolved in why are they threatened? What are some of the threats? Why are they going extinct? That has then led to more work looking at long-term survival, all these things. And now I've joined SANCCOB over 6 years ago. And at SANCCOB, obviously, there's a huge variety of research that we deal with. Being a rehab facility, so we hand rear African penguin chicks. There's a lot of research going into that. We get oiled birds, injured bird, emaciated birds. But I'm also still working a lot in the colonies, looking still at kind of seabird fisheries interactions, as you mentioned. We have some new, very exciting collaborations with some team of bioacoustics scientists. So all like new, exciting things. So yeah, it's kind of evolving every day.
I love that. I think that's what's so fun about penguin research, right? Is that there's always something new and different and a lot to learn about them entirely and seabirds in general, right? One of the questions that we had is about some of your more recent research or one of your recent papers, which was looking at circovirus in penguins. What is circovirus and what does that mean for penguin species?
I actually have to admit I'm not a specialist in diseases. I kind of got into that through the SANCCOB work. And as far as I know, and a lot of people might know a lot better, the circovirus is a virus that was detected in penguins in Antarctica. And it was in several Southern Ocean species. And because we were actually doing research on avian influenza, so on the bird flu, which we do have in African penguins. So colleagues of mine sampled quite a lot of African penguin colonies, both in South Africa and Namibia. And because we had these samples available, we said, well, let's also test for other potential diseases. So one of my colleagues in Namibia then said, look, he knows about the circovirus and it's not sure whether it has actually reached other areas and whether it is in Africa. So that's why we tested for that. But the main focus of the work has actually been on avian influenza, which unfortunately has been affecting the African penguin, and it's also affecting other penguin species. And it is still around, and we are quite worried about it. We go through these different spills of more and less birds affected. But so the main focus is actually on avian influenza.
Okay. I know that there was sort of a lockdown that happened recently in SANCCOB. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we've had the avian influenza virus or different strains of it actually since 2018. First, we had them affect some tern species. Then we had lots of cormorants dying of avian influenza. And then in the more recent years, we've also had African penguins testing positive and dying of avian influenza. And being a rehab center that sees over 2,000 birds a year, it's obviously tricky because the birds come in. There's no like quick test, so we can test the birds, but we only have a result 2-3 days later. So there was always a risk that we would be admitting birds that would be positive and that could spread the virus within the center. Luckily or amazingly, for almost 4 years, we've managed to keep the virus out of the center, thanks to our veterinarians and rehabbers who also scanned birds before. There were birds that had to be euthanized without letting them into the center. We had different quarantine facilities for a while. And then unfortunately, late last year in 2022, we did have a positive case within SANCCOB, a chick that showed symptoms and then died shortly after, which that led the state veterinarian to put SANCCOB in quarantine. So that meant we weren't allowed to admit any new birds to the center and also not to release any birds. And that was a big issue because we had just admitted over 300 penguin chicks that were abandoned kind of at the late in their breeding season. They're usually kind of in and out. They're quite quick. They're usually kind of relatively healthy chicks. So you just have to feed them for a few weeks and you get them out again. So that was a plan. But then being under quarantine meant that we were stuck with over 400 birds for several weeks. And because we were still seeing other birds that needed treatment, we actually had to run 2 facilities at the same time. So we had the birds that were basically under lockdown in our normal facility, and then we had a secondary facility where we would admit new cases coming in. Then within the facility, we tried to have different quarantine areas and stuff. So it was quite intense. It was very labor intensive. It obviously then also fell into our summer holidays and Christmas, and so all the joys of any disaster always hitting over public holidays. Amazingly, most of our birds actually recovered. So besides, I think 4 or 5 birds that actually died due to avian influenza, all other birds that tested positive and showed symptoms all recovered. And then in, I think, early February, the quarantine was lifted and we were able to slowly release these birds. So they've all now been released and are all happily out there. But yeah, it was quite an intense exercise, and we've learned a lot through that.
I'm sure. It's just like, I can't imagine just being around all of these birds and all of the protocol, you had to do as a person. Getting into that space and exiting that space is quite a lot. Their own little pandemic, if you will, that we're all kind of over that, aren't we?
Yes. It all reminded us very much of COVID. There was a lot of biosecurity. There was a lot of hand sanitizing and sanitizing everything. So yeah, it was kind of we had learned a lot already over the last few years, so that helped.
I'm sure it did. One of the other questions we have for you is, how did you get involved in penguin research, and how did that become your pathway?
I was actually thinking about that, and I don't have one of these stories like already that I was a little child and I saw a penguin and I fell in love. It wasn't like that. I actually started working on seabirds by coincidence because I was at a university and there were interesting people and they were looking for a student assistant, and that's how I got into seabirds. I'm also not the big birder, like I'm not a twitcher or anything. And then I was actually doing my master's thesis on gulls in Chile. But I had colleagues who were working on Humboldt penguins, and they asked me if I wanted to come along. So obviously I tagged along to some field work. And that's how I got into penguin. And then I assisted them with some penguin work in New Zealand, actually. And then I had lived in Chile and I had volunteered before in Namibia, and I kind of looked at the 2 countries and I wanted to return. I thought, well, what species are there that I could study for my PhD that are in both places? So there's a Humboldt penguin in Chile, there's the African penguin in Namibia and South Africa. It's very similar species, closely related, both upwelling systems. So I just kind of chose the species as kind of my reason to travel the world, and it's worked out quite well. I've gotten around quite far working on penguins, so that is definitely an advantage. And then obviously there are great indicator species. They're great to work with. You can look at a lot of ecological phenomena looking at penguins. So they're just really, really great species to work with.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think they're so fascinating, and I do love that they really are spread out throughout the Southern Hemisphere, which is so much fun. Warm places, cold places. We can see them wherever we like. And I know you did visit the Falklands as well. Did you do research there too?
Yes, I was lucky enough to be involved in a project on southern rockhopper species in the Falklands. So that was very interesting because it was very different to the African penguin. So I had worked on African penguins before, and African penguins theoretically can breed any time of the year. They're not synchronous at all. You can have a bird on an egg, the next nest has a fledgling. And then I went to the Falklands and I was told by my colleagues, no, you get there, you put some loggers out just before the females go on their trip after egg laying. And I thought, like, but how do I know that the female will leave the next day? Like, when do I put the log on? And they said, oh no, it's going to be the 25th or 26th of October or something it was. I'm like, yeah, right. I thought it was a joke. And then I get there, and it was on the 25th of October that all the females left. And said, yeah, no, it's always been the 25th for the last 10 years that we've been studying this species. So to work with a different penguin species that completely behaves completely different was very, very interesting.
I wish we had like October 25th as like World Rockhopper Day. We have the.
I hopefully didn't get the date wrong now. It might be something I can't remember what date it was, but it was like a specific date. I could look in my notes.
That's awesome. I do want to know too, like, do you have a favorite penguin species because you've worked with so many?
I don't think I have a favorite penguin species. I mean, I haven't seen all of them. There's lots and lots of species that I haven't seen. I have some favorite places more than species, I think. So there's some very special places that I've been to. But all the species are they're different. They have different characters. I mean, even within the same species, birds have different characters. So it's tricky to say. Like, I don't have the favorite species. I mean, I've spent most of my time working on African penguins now, so I guess they're the closest to my heart at the moment.
I feel the same way. It's very hard to like pick one. When people say, oh, what's your favorite animal? It's like, oh, there's so many. It depends on the day, and it depends on how I'm feeling and where I am in the world, right? Kind of another question, focusing more on some of the current work that you're doing. Have there been any breakthroughs in regards to the fishing regulations around South Africa, making sure that penguins are able to sustain themselves?
Yeah, we wish. So just to give a little bit of background, we have now had over 12 years of an experiment where we've closed certain areas around the main colonies to fishing. Others were open. There was like alternating. And now it has obviously turned in a huge political debate about, is it worth it? Is it not worth it? What is the cost to the industry? Obviously, in a country like South Africa, you have to consider livelihoods of people working in the fishing industry. We don't want to be blamed for people losing their jobs, losing their income. So it is a very tricky decision. However, the kind of seabird scientist community agrees that it is worth it, and it's not that we are like asking for a complete closure of the fisheries. We are only asking for kind of certain restricted zones to just alleviate a little bit the pressure on the penguins. The main focus should actually be on recovering our fish stocks, because our sardine stocks, which is the main prey of the African penguin, is very, very low at the moment. And we actually agree, in that sense, we agree with the fishing industry that we need a healthy sardine stock so they can successfully fish and people can earn their income. And the seabirds have enough to eat. So unfortunately, there hasn't really been a breakthrough. There has a little bit been a breakthrough that we definitely have the attention of the politicians. So it's the minister herself who is very much engaging in the topic. We have currently an international panel of, I think, 7 world-renowned scientists, from fisheries managers, modelers, economists to world-famous seabird ecologists, sitting together looking at the thing. So it's probably the one species in the world where literally we have people from all around the world now like studying our data and looking at it. And we're really, really hoping that by June, our minister will make a favorable decision and close fishing around some of the most important breeding colonies for the African penguin.
Wow. That's coming up pretty quickly here too. I mean, I know May just started and June's right around the corner. So yeah, that's great. And what has the local community's response been? I know you talked a little bit to the fisheries and the people that work there, but the rest of the community, how do they seem to respond to all of this?
Yeah, I think most people, obviously, I mean, the African penguin is a very iconic species here locally and international. People flock to South Africa to see it, and that is one of our arguments, that we actually think for the country there's more economic value in having a healthy marine wildlife, because it's not only the penguins, it's other seabird species, our whales, our dolphins, our sharks. So it's all, the entire marine ecosystem. So that's kind of one of our arguments, that the economic value of having a healthy marine system is actually bigger than what the fishing industry is currently supporting the local economy with. So most people are actually obviously very much liking the penguins and in favor. It is obviously difficult kind of looking at job losses. So it's obviously different if you ask the people that, live somewhere and want to go down to the beach and see penguins. They're obviously all for the protection of the species. Whereas if you ask people that, need to make their living and need to earn money. That's why we are trying to work with the fishing community and see if there are solutions that can actually work for both. But so overall, I mean, it is a very iconic species, in a lot of people's livelihoods depend on the penguins being there, on tourists coming, on showing people around. So it is one of the key species here, especially around Cape Town, where we have the land-based colonies that you can actually visit, and it's a very special place.
Absolutely. And we're really excited to announce that 2023 is Year of the African Penguin. So all of us here at Penguins International, we're celebrating African penguins. We're, of course, meeting with scientists like you to get the word out about why they're endangered and just some more information about them. I was hoping
Let's hope that 2023 will be the year of the permanent closures around main African penguin breeding colonies. That would that would make my year of the African penguin.
That would be absolutely the best news, wouldn't it? And we're all here to support and help out where we can. I want to kind of touch too about your GPS tracking on penguins. So we know that there's some data out there, historical data of penguins traveling out to go foraging for their fish. What has been done recently with the tracking to see how far they're traveling to feed?
Yeah, so we've been basically doing this tracking since the early 2000s. So it's actually a group of scientists. So I started doing it in Namibia. Other people started it here in South Africa. And now we are basically all working together as teams, continuing the tracking. And all this work, all this data that has been collected is actually feeding into these analysis that we are now presenting to the minister. So to try to really look at which ones are the areas that are important for the African penguins, and which ones are the ones that we would like to have close to fishing, just to help the birds to find more fish there. So we've basically kind of continued the tracking. Obviously, as technology advances, we can add more and more. So now there's a lot more tracking that is also, for example, using underwater cameras. So colleagues of mine from BirdLife South Africa, for example, have worked on that, and they've found amazing things about the birds. For example, how they work in groups, like a little bit similar to dolphins, kind of chasing the bait balls up and those things, which we didn't really necessarily know before. We are now with some teams of people working with bioacoustics. We are now using hydrophones, because one of the issues we're encountering here in one of our bays is actually the underwater noise pollution through shipping traffic. So we're deploying hydrophones to understand what birds actually hear underwater, and also how they communicate at sea. So we know that they can call each other, and we suspect that if it's too noisy, basically, that they struggle to find each other, which then means they can't forage in a group and therefore are less successful foraging. So it all has these kind of ripple down effects. So the tracking has kind of incorporated a lot more other questions. And then obviously now we can track birds during the non-breeding season. So again, colleagues of mine are tracking a lot of birds kind of outside the breeding season. We've done some studies on the fledglings and juveniles, where they go before they actually return to the breeding colony. So yeah, with every tracking study, we actually learn a little bit more. We can identify more areas that are important, also outside the breeding areas. In a way, luckily, a lot of the areas that we've identified for outside the breeding areas are actually overlap with the areas that they use during breeding. So if we can protect the areas that are important during the breeding season, that will also have a positive spin-off effect on the non-breeding season. So yeah, we're learning a lot. What we've learned also so we're also putting little transponders into the birds. So we have ground readers in all the colonies. So birds, we can see what colonies they return to. So we're also learning, for example, that there is a lot more movement between colonies, especially in young birds. So they seem to be kind of checking out different colonies before they decide where they want to settle to breed. And it looks very much like they do obviously favor the ones where they can see that there's fish around. Maybe more importantly, than where they were born, which was always kind of the idea initially, that they would always return to their natal colonies. But it seems like if their natal colony doesn't have much fish, then they might as well just go somewhere else.
Wow, that's super interesting. I had no idea that they were, house hunting, if you will, trying to find a better spot to be. It's kind of like, when you leave the nest of your parents and find where you want to live in a way.
Yes.
Except for, we have full fridges and don't have to worry about where our food comes from. Do you have a favorite field story or experience with penguins?
Sure, it's always tricky, and I know one shouldn't put human behaviors in them, but obviously sitting in a penguin colony, it does happen. So one of my favorite places is Mercury Island, which is an island in Namibia. It's off the Namibian desert. You can actually see the desert. You see the hyenas walking over the beach, but it's completely isolated because there's hundreds of kilometers of desert all around you, and it's this tiny little rock with which used to have thousands of African penguins. Unfortunately, it seems like that colony has also crashed. So we are trying to understand what happened there. But yeah, I've spent quite a lot of time there, and there's the birds kind of walk down this little path in the morning from the colony to jump into the water, and there's this kind of rock pool that they go in and they wash. And if it's low tide, it's quite a steep jump. It's several meters that they have to jump into the water. And then one morning there was one bird who clearly had a little bit of fright of heights, and it reminded me of the typical scene in the public swimming pool, somebody standing on the 5-meter jump board and doesn't want to jump. So the penguin would let everybody pass, and then he would look down again and like, oh no, I'm not jumping. And so that was just I spent probably an hour watching this bird kind of thinking what to do. Eventually he got pushed in by somebody else, and then he was absolutely happy. But yeah, that is I think still one of my favorite moments, just watching them go in the morning. It's just so beautiful.
What a fun thing to observe. And I feel like, isn't that so typical? You're standing on the diving board and your brother or sister is like, go for it, if you're taking too long. Wow, that's so amazing. I love that. I love that story. Thank you for sharing. What is something you wish people understood or knew better about SANCCOB or your projects?
So SANCCOB started in 1968, so we are over 50 years old, and it started as a organization that was assisting with oil spills. So there was a lot of oil spills during those times in South Africa, and so we're still known as an organization that takes in oiled birds and cleans them and releases them back. Luckily, we haven't had that many oil spills, although we still have. And as the population gets smaller and smaller, obviously, even though we get less oil birds, it still has a huge effect and potentially could be devastating for the species. But SANCCOB has grown to so much more. So some people still think, oh, that's a place where you take oiled birds. But I mean, now our main focus is actually the hand rearing of abandoned chicks. We are now incubating several hundred eggs that were laid in the wild and then abandoned by their parents. So we are really bolstering the wild population to that. Then we work very closely with the managing authorities in the colonies. So we have rangers in almost all the main colonies in South Africa, and we are busy with a Namibian NGO to establish the same program in Namibia. So we basically have people working in the colonies, making sure the birds are safe. We work very strongly with other organizations like BirdLife South Africa and WWF on the fisheries interactions. So it is, and we do a lot of research. We work with, as you said in the intro, with a lot of international and local researchers. So it's a huge organization. I mean, we're not that huge people-wise, but just the topics that we touch on, it's more kind of turning into a conservation research organization and not only, oh, that's where you bring your oiled bird. So sometimes that's kind of still a little bit like, oh, it's the people that you have oiled birds, and it's so much more.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing all of the stories you've shared thus far, it's like there's so much going on. And being a nimble team too, that's a lot of work. And that's why it's like we need to get as much, help as possible. So what would SANCCOB look like if you had unlimited funding and manpower and minimal legislative barriers?
Well, being the research manager, obviously I would dream of having a proper research center with definitely a lot more people. We are currently 2 researchers at SANCCOB, and usually we have a research intern, and then we collaborate with other researchers. But I would really love to have more research in-house. Obviously, lab facilities, currently a lot of the testing, for example, for avian influenza or even sexing of birds, those things we have to send to labs. So to have like a proper lab and equipment would be great. I would personally love to have a research vessel to go out to all these places and do a lot more at sea work, which is obviously always tricky if you have to rely on other people's boats and things like that. If you ask my rehab colleagues, they would probably want a lot more pools, a lot more pens, a lot more facilities. Our vet probably would like to have more surgery rooms, more vets, because he works really, I think, 24/7. So I think there's a lot that we would love to do if we had more capacity. So I think more staff, more facilities. I mean, I could joke we would probably like to take over all the colonies, which are all currently managed by several different managing authorities, which they all do a great job, but they're also all under funding constraints and staff limitations. And so if in my dream world we would kind of run the show and take over the African penguin world, but I think there's other people that would have a say into that as well.
Yes, I'm sure. I love that. That would be the ideal goal, right? What actions can the general public take right now to help SANCCOB, to help African penguins?
Yeah, so obviously the typical, being an NGO, we are fully donor funded. Funnily, we are listed in a lot of South African legislation as the responder, for example, for oil spills. However, we don't get government support. So we are basically on 24/7 standby for any oil or other emergency, but we have to raise our own salaries. We have to raise the money to keep the lights on and the water running. So obviously, being a donor-funded organization, funding is always one of the limitations. So we have some amazing ways to donate. You can adopt an egg, you can adopt a chick, you can choose on our website between different projects, different parts of the organization. But then I always say, especially if it's people from around the world, obviously, I always think whatever you do for conservation will help the bigger picture. So I always joke, if you help the wetland next to your house and preserve the frogs, it's as good as preserving the African penguin. So I always feel like you don't have to put all your eggs into the African penguin basket. You can also do it in your local community. But then it things, for example, with our fishing discussion. So for example, the 80 or 90% of the anchovy, which is the other species that is heavily fished here and eaten by penguins, goes into fish meal production that is exported. So I always say, eating less meat in the northern hemisphere might actually help the African penguins, because they need to catch less fish to feed, farm yachts somewhere in the US or in Europe. So there's a lot of things with the global trade and everything that is actually having effects on us here as well. Things like pollution. Obviously, we're struggling with climate change effects. So there's a lot of things I think that people around the world can do, just in changing their day-to-day behavior, that in the bigger picture will also assist the African penguin.
And with the fish meal, do we know what that's going into exactly, or is that a really hard thing to track?
So we're actually trying to track that down now. So we've received the numbers basically of percentage of the catch that goes into fish meal and how much is exported. We haven't really gotten a finger on where does it go, what is it actually used for? Is it used for fish farming, for example? Is it used for cattle feed? Is it used for animal cat food? So we are trying to look into that to also kind of address some of the consumer market. So not only to raise the issue with the fishing industry, but actually go back to the consumer. So in South Africa, we, for example, have, it's led by WWF, kind of a seafood advice system that you can, if you want to buy fish in the supermarket, you can go in the app and you can check whether it's sustainable, harvested, those things. So we're trying to look at those things as well, to see how we can influence consumer markets to kind of save the fish for the African penguins.
In the United States, we have something very similar, and I will add that to the screen right now so everyone can see it. It's Seafood Watch. So it's something very similar where if you're going to purchase something, you can look it up, or if you're at a restaurant, you can kind of ask where it's found, and that helps.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, really, really important stuff that anyone can do, right, to make an impact. Are there any other thoughts, stories, or things you'd like to share with the audience today?
So we just this morning I got, so we have our rangers in the different colonies, and we had one of the rangers found a bird that was limping, and it had an amputated foot, which then often shows that it might have been a bird that was recently at SANCCOB and recently had surgery, so it's still recovering and it's limping a little bit. So we usually say, look, it's probably fine, the bird is probably fine, but because we microchip all the birds that we release from SANCCOB, the rangers can easily check if it's one of ours. So the rangers checked the transponder, and I checked in our database. We first struggled to find it in our database, but then I went back into the bigger database and found it was a bird that had come in 2016 from that colony where it was seen now, with a foot injury. So in 2016, our vet, who was actually the vet before the one that is now our vet, because I think he only started in 2017, would have probably amputated this bird. This bird has been seen every single year crossing our ground reader in Simonstown, so it seems to be actively breeding there. And now it seems to have some other injury, which is probably unrelated to the amputated foot. So it's a great example to show that what the vets did in 2016 actually worked perfectly well. The bird has been happily probably breeding and around for several years now, and now it might have some other injury so it's now coming through to SANCCOB, and our vet is going to look at it again. But at least it's a great example how the bird lived very happily for several years with its amputated foot and is doing really well. So those stories are always nice. Obviously, we don't want to really see our birds again, but it's nice to re-encounter them in the wild and know that they're actually out there, that they're doing well, and then that all the hard work that our vet and rehab team has put in has actually paid off.
That's wonderful. I love that story, and I hope he or she is okay as they take a look and see what's going on. But like you said, how many years has that been of that penguin just being totally fine? That's wonderful news and shows the important work that you do. How can our penguin community get in touch with you or follow your work?
So best is probably just to check on our webpage. I have to admit I'm not very good on social media. So you can check on our webpage. Our PR team is a lot better at social media than I am. So they will update and post. And we also have a Facebook page. I think we have an Instagram account probably. So you can just, if you just Google SANCCOB, you can find all these things. And otherwise, my email address is also on our webpage. So if you're interested in any particular research, you can also just email and we can share some of our knowledge in papers and things like that. But following SANCCOB on social media is probably the best to follow our work.
Wonderful. And I just shared on the screen as well. We have a special page put together to honor Dr. Kata and all of her work. So if there's some more resource links that you would like to take a look at, you can go ahead and look at that website there. So thank you again for sharing all of your experience. It's been so lovely talking to you, and we're really excited to just kind of honor your work and all that you've done for penguins. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you.